When you picture a security architecture on paper, it often looks calm and orderly. Clear boundaries, defined roles, sensible controls, and neat diagrams showing how things should work. The problem is that real incidents are not calm and orderly, and stress has a way of revealing design weaknesses that normal reviews never notice. People make decisions quickly, information is incomplete, systems behave in surprising ways, and what seemed like a reasonable control can become a bottleneck or a blind spot. Tabletop exercises are a practical way to test whether the architecture still holds up when the environment is noisy and time matters. They are structured discussions where a team walks through a realistic scenario and practices how the system, the processes, and the people would respond. The purpose is not to perform theater or to embarrass anyone, but to validate assumptions and find gaps before a real attacker or real outage forces you to learn the hard way. This episode explains how tabletop exercises can validate security architecture, what to look for when stress enters the picture, and how beginners can think about outcomes in terms of design improvements and testable requirements. When done well, a tabletop exercise is like a fire drill for architecture decisions, showing you whether the exits you designed are actually reachable. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A tabletop exercise works best when it focuses on a specific architecture scope and a specific kind of stress, rather than trying to simulate every possible disaster at once. Stress can come from many directions: a suspected data breach, ransomware spreading through endpoints, a critical service outage, a compromised credential, or a supply chain issue where a dependency behaves maliciously. The scenario you choose should touch important trust boundaries and high-value assets, because those are where architecture decisions matter most. For beginners, it helps to think of a scenario as a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, where each part introduces new information and forces decisions. The beginning might be an unusual alert or a user report. The middle might include evidence of lateral movement or data access, and the end might involve containment, recovery, and communication. The purpose is to see whether the architecture provides enough visibility to understand what is happening, enough control to contain it, and enough resilience to keep essential services operating. A tabletop is not about perfect predictions. It is about discovering whether your design assumptions survive realistic pressure. If assumptions break, that is valuable learning. One of the most important ways tabletop exercises validate architecture is by testing observability, which is your ability to see what the system is doing. In calm conditions, teams often assume they will notice an attack because they have logging and monitoring, but tabletop discussions quickly reveal whether those logs are actually meaningful and accessible. A good architecture should provide timely signals for key events like authentication anomalies, privilege changes, unusual data exports, and unexpected service behavior. Under stress, you need to answer basic questions quickly, such as which accounts are involved, what systems are affected, and what data might be at risk. If the architecture does not provide a clear way to find those answers, you have an observability gap. Tabletop exercises make that gap obvious because participants will ask, how do we know this happened, and where do we check? If the answer is unclear or depends on someone's memory, your design is fragile. Observability is not only a tooling issue. It is an architectural requirement about what events must be captured and how identity and context are attached to them. A tabletop can surface which events are missing and which boundaries produce blind spots. Containment is another area where tabletops reveal whether architecture choices are practical in real time. Many designs rely on segmentation, least privilege, and controlled access to limit how far an attacker can move. In a tabletop scenario, you simulate decisions like disabling accounts, blocking network paths, isolating services, or shutting down certain interfaces. The exercise helps you evaluate whether those actions are feasible without causing unacceptable collateral damage. For example, if you suspect a credential is compromised, can you revoke access quickly without breaking critical workflows? Or does everything share a single overpowered account? If a service is behaving maliciously, can you isolate it from sensitive systems? Or does it have broad access because of convenience decisions made earlier? Under stress, teams may choose broad shutdowns if they lack precise controls, and that can create availability harm that rivals the attack itself. A strong architecture supports targeted containment, where you can cut off specific paths while keeping safe operations running. Tabletop exercises expose whether containment actions are precise or blunt. Tabletops also validate the clarity of authorization boundaries, because incidents often involve questions about who is allowed to do what during a response. In an emergency, people may need to perform actions they rarely do, like rotating credentials, changing access rules, or approving emergency changes. If the architecture and governance are unclear, the team may either hesitate, losing precious time, or act impulsively, creating new risks. A well-designed architecture supports separation of duties while still allowing emergency response to happen safely. That might mean having predefined emergency roles or processes that allow rapid action with accountability. In a tabletop, you can see whether participants know which roles have authority, how decisions are recorded, and how to avoid making permanent insecure changes in a rush. You also see whether the system enforces authorization consistently or whether there are unofficial shortcuts. Shortcuts are often the real attack paths because attackers exploit the same convenience routes people use under pressure. By discussing how response actions would be executed, tabletops highlight whether authorization is both secure and operationally workable. Communication and decision flow are not just organizational concerns. They directly interact with architecture because architecture determines what information is available and what actions are possible. In a tabletop, you practice how the team learns about the incident, how they confirm what is real, and how they coordinate containment and recovery. If the architecture produces too many noisy alerts, teams may ignore important signals, which is a design problem because it reduces effective detection. If the architecture produces too little context, teams may waste time chasing false leads, which again is a design problem because it limits visibility. The exercise also reveals whether critical knowledge is concentrated in one person, like only one engineer knows how to isolate a service safely, which creates a single point of failure in response. A resilient architecture is supported by clear operational knowledge and repeatable actions, not heroic improvisation. Tabletop discussions can lead to architectural requirements like consistent audit trails, clear service ownership, and documented isolation procedures. These are not soft issues. They are part of making the architecture survivable under stress. Another valuable outcome of tabletop exercises is discovering where security controls conflict with availability and usability when time pressure is high. For example, a design might require strong approvals for changes, which is good for preventing tampering, but during a fast-moving incident, slow approvals can prevent containment. A tabletop can help you identify where you need a controlled emergency pathway that still preserves accountability, such as a break glass process for privileged access. The architecture should anticipate that emergencies happen and provide a safe way to respond without dismantling security controls. Similarly, a design might rely on strict network segmentation, but if segmentation makes it difficult to collect forensic data or restore systems, response becomes harder. The goal is not to weaken segmentation, but to ensure the architecture supports secure response activities. Under stress, teams will prioritize restoring services, and if the architecture does not support that safely, they may take risky shortcuts. Tabletop exercises help you identify these tension points before they become real decisions made in panic. Those tension points can then become design improvements. To make tabletop exercises produce actionable architecture changes, you need to translate discussion findings into concrete requirements and validation steps. If the exercise reveals that the team cannot quickly identify which data was accessed, that suggests a requirement for more detailed audit logs tied to identity and data objects. If the exercise reveals that isolating a compromised service would break essential operations, that suggests a requirement for redundancy, graceful degradation, or more granular segmentation. If the exercise reveals that credential rotation is slow and risky, that suggests requirements for better key management and safer rotation workflows. The important thing is that findings should not remain as vague lessons. They should become statements about what the system must be able to do under stress. These statements can then be validated through future exercises and functional tests, which creates a feedback loop. Tabletop exercises are not a one-time performance. They are a way to continuously refine the architecture. For beginners, this is a powerful concept because it shows how design and operations connect. Architecture is not just about preventing incidents, but about enabling response and recovery. It is also worth noting that tabletop exercises can validate assumptions about dependencies and external partners, which are common sources of surprise. Many architectures rely on external identity services, cloud providers, managed security services, or third-party integrations. In a tabletop, you can simulate what happens if an external service is degraded, compromised, or behaving unexpectedly. You can ask whether your architecture has safe fallbacks, such as denying sensitive operations when identity cannot be verified, or whether it fails open in ways that are dangerous. You can also examine whether you have enough visibility into external interactions to detect misuse. Even without deep technical details, the exercise can reveal whether external dependencies are treated as trusted by default or verified at boundaries. Stress often arrives through dependencies, such as a sudden outage or a supply chain issue, and tabletops are a safe way to explore those possibilities. If your architecture assumes dependencies will always behave, you will likely find gaps. Turning those gaps into boundary controls and monitoring expectations is one of the best uses of an exercise. As you run tabletop exercises, the biggest mindset shift is realizing that architecture quality is partly measured by how well it supports human decision-making during abnormal events. A secure design should make the safe action the easy action, even when people are tired, rushed, and uncertain. If the only effective containment action is to shut down everything, then the architecture is not providing enough precision. If the team cannot tell whether an alert is meaningful, the architecture is not providing enough context. If the only way to regain control is to break normal processes, the architecture is missing safe emergency pathways. Tabletop exercises reveal these weaknesses because they put people into a simulated stress environment where those weaknesses matter. That is why they are so valuable for beginners. They show that security architecture is not only about preventing attacks, but also about maintaining trust when prevention fails. In real life, something will fail, and the architecture must help you respond without chaos. The main takeaway is that tabletop exercises are a practical validation tool because they test the architecture's real-world survivability, not just its theoretical correctness. By walking through realistic scenarios, you can assess whether your design provides observability, supports targeted containment, enforces authorization boundaries under pressure, and enables safe recovery. You also learn where controls create operational friction that could lead to risky shortcuts, and you can design safer emergency pathways before incidents force improvisation. The exercise findings become valuable only when they are documented as gaps and translated into testable design requirements, which can then be validated in future exercises and acceptance testing. Over time, this creates an architecture that improves, not one that slowly drifts away from its assumptions. Running tabletop exercises is one of the most approachable ways to connect security theory to real-world resilience because it centers on behavior and decisions rather than technical tricks. When you can look at your architecture and confidently say it supports you under stress, you have validated something that diagrams alone cannot prove.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.